This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Peter Gray. He's an American psychologist who currently occupies the position of research professor of psychology at Boston College. I stumbled into Peter's world, his work, quite randomly, reading an article talking about the need for college students, this new need they have to seek out counseling on issues that decades ago they never would have sought out a counselor for, never would have sought out mental help before, but now they do. It brings up the issue of resiliency. The simple question becomes, are young people today resilient? Peter has a really interesting book out, Free to Learn, Why Unleashing the Instinct to Play Will Make Our Children Happier, More Self-Reliant, and Better Students for Life. Peter is a well-known critic of standard education systems, a man near and dear to my heart. Rote memorization, sitting at a desk, and doing that for 12, 16, 20 years of your life while you're leaving something out. In an age of no dodgeball, political correctness run amok, safe spaces everywhere, Peter Gray brings us all back down to earth. And perhaps leads us to the simple conclusion that looking backwards in time might give us a better perspective about going forward. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Peter Gray. I catch these headlines, and I think they were in the Daily Mail. I'm not sure. This is how I learned about you. And I see these headlines with this eminent psychologist talking about young people on college campuses. And I'm in my 40s now, but in the last couple months, I've been dealing with a lot of people in their 20s, whether they're contractors or whatnot. And I'm seeing something to me that's not right. And when I read your article, I was like, oh my gosh, this man is describing what I'm seeing. This is kind of just my only small sample, but I'm seeing something really unusual and odd with young people in their 20s in particular. And I can come up with my own theories and everything. I know you've studied this like crazy, and we're going to talk about that. I look at things like Facebook. I look at this information overload. And I see young people that are seemingly unable to deal with some minor down period, and they literally melt down. And as you have said, and I would love for you to jump right into this, there seems to be an issue with resilience today amongst young people.
Very briefly, that does seem to be the problem. There certainly seems to be an issue with resilience with young people today. Before I go on about this, though, I want to qualify it a little bit. I'm certainly of the older generation. I make no secret of the fact I'm 71 years old. I grew up in the 1950s and so there's a tendency every era for the older generation to, in one way or another, see fault with the younger generation. And I just want to be careful about that. There's a tendency, I don't want to jump on a bandwagon here, I think there's a lot to admire about the younger generation, certainly as I see them and experience them, and by all indications from statistical reports too. I think that all in all, they are, well, there's no doubt, but they're more tolerant of individual differences. They are in many ways kinder to people, especially to people who are different. They're less racist, less homophobic, less violent statistically, despite what many people may think, because we're always complaining about violence, but less violence, all violent and all in all. But the fact of the matter is apparently that they are not as tough. And we are hearing that, not as emotionally tough. And we're hearing that from all quarters. We're hearing that from employees. We're hearing that and I've been hearing it lately from college counseling services. And that's what led to my blog post on this topic on Psychology Today, which has definitely gone viral and over 600,000 views, and there are 700 comments and over 200,000 Facebook likes on this. And it was without anybody letting me know. The Wall Street Journal republished the whole thing, and it's been circulating all over the place. And so it has generated a lot of discussion. And what's interesting in this discussion, there's almost nobody saying that, no, this does not seem to be true. As far as I can tell, students, young people today, young adults today are as tough and resilient as ever. Nobody seems to be saying that, including the young people who are talking about their own vulnerabilities and their own perceptions of that in other young people. So I do think there is something to be said here. Statistically speaking, we know that diagnosable mental disorders among young adults are at an all-time high. And it's not just that we are seeing disorders that we didn't look for before, because even by standard clinical questionnaires that have been given in unchanged form over decades, if you look at what today would be the cutoff point for suspected major depression, or the cutoff point on an anxiety scale for suspected clinically significant anxiety disorder, those have been continuously increasing, actually since about the 1950s, but there seems to be an acceleration of that increase in the last couple of decades. There's no doubt about the increased psychological problems of young adults today compared to in the past. In addition, now what we're hearing from colleges and universities, specifically from the heads of the guidance counselors, is that their services are being flooded by people who are coming for problems that in the past would have been regarded as problems that most students would have taken care of somehow themselves. They may have talked about it with other people on campus, with other students, figured out a way to solve the problem, but not so much seen it as a psychological problem that they have to see a psychotherapist to talk about. So things like roommate issues or relationship breakups or getting a bad grade in a course, this is becoming a bigger and bigger source of problem. People are not accepting bad grades in courses. Then having sort of an emotional breakdown about this that incapacitates them in some way. And then that even then becomes a reason for subsequent poor performance in school. I couldn't perform. I couldn't take this test because I was too anxious or I've been depressed. So it's having an effect of actually disrupting in some ways significantly the academic mission of the university.
Peter, pull apart the environment for a moment. And what I mean by that is that as a man in my 40s, you're a man in your 70s. Okay, we came along in slightly different environments. Perhaps it's easily arguable. I didn't see the internet till I was in my 20s. So what is it about today that you think, either factually or theorize, what about the environment has led to this overall population increase of these various issues? Because if we just look at it from a pure statistical sense, I mean, there's a very good chance that if you and I were put back in time and we were in our 20s today, we would have the same problems statistically.
Yeah, no, it's not that people are biologically different. It's just people are growing up in a different kind of world. What is it? Of course, the world has changed in many ways. So what aspects of this change seem to be causing this problem? I argue that we have become a radically different world for young people to grow up from than the world that young people have always grown up in the past. Throughout human history, children have spent lots of time away from adults, lots of time playing and exploring with other kids, sometimes working on jobs where other kids are their workmates, and depending on what part of the world you're looking in, but away from adults. where they have to make their own decisions, where they have to solve their own problems, where they learn how to deal with minor bullying, where they learn they get lost and find their way home. They get in trouble and find their way out. This has been part of childhood throughout human history. You know, when I was a child in the 1950s, we had school, but it wasn't the big deal it is today. We weren't in school for as many hours or as many weeks of the year. We didn't have homework, certainly not in elementary school. We had some in high school, but nothing like students have today. And when we were not in school, we were not in adult-directed activities, and we were allowed, typically from the age of about 5 on, to go outdoors without adults watching us, to find our friends, to roam the neighborhood, to do all kinds of interesting and thrilling and somewhat dangerous things, and learn how to deal with those dangers. Learn that we are tough enough to do it. And children by nature, everywhere you observe children, want to do this. They want to get out. They want to get away from adults. They want to play with other kids. But for the first time in history, significantly large numbers of young people are not being allowed to do that. They are more or less constantly under the direction, guidance, surveillance of adults. And my argument is, you can't learn to be an adult unless you can get away from adults, because as long as there are adults around, and especially in this day and age where we are so protective and in the good sense caring of our young people, but we go that to extremes on this, then we adults are solving their problems. If there's a dispute among a couple of kids, we solve the problem rather than let them figure out how to solve it. We don't even allow kids to get lost anymore and find their way home. We rarely even give them the time and opportunity to get out there and discover what they really enjoy, because we're always putting them in activities that are more or less our decision to, as adults, to put them into these activities because we think it's good for them, rather than allowing them to figure out what they really enjoy. So I think that's the fundamental change.
Talk about for a second the fragility aspect here. I look at how, for example, and you might think this is a stretch, I look at forest fire prevention in the States. And we've cut back on the ability to allow fires. We suppress fires. I look at the financial markets, and we have made things more fragile with so many rules. We don't let anybody fail. And so I see this. We don't let a forest fail. We don't let the financial markets fail, and we don't let children fail. And when you don't let children fail, you're left with a fragile child later in life.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. And I would say that even deeper than that is we're not letting children take risks. And when you take risks, the definition of a risk is that you might fail. You might fall down and get hurt. You might venture into this activity, trying to make friends with somebody, and you fail at that friendship. You may start off, you may develop a hobby, and you may find the first few times you try to pursue this hobby, then do the things that you want to do, create the thing you're trying to create, you fail at it. I think that there's a tendency, and I've noticed this on the responses, some of the responses to my blog post, to relate to this not letting them fail to schooling. And there is some truth to that increasingly in school, as partly No Child Left Behind, means that, first of all, we're giving them far more work than in the past. But secondly, we're trying to do everything we can to ensure that they're not held back, that they don't get an F. We went through this kind of self-esteem movement beginning kind of in the 1980s, where everybody was supposed to be getting more or less constant positive feedback and not negative feedback for what they're doing. So we've had this funny combination in schools of, in one sense, much more demands on them, and on another sense, a little bit less of a sense of it's their responsibility to meet those demands, an increasing sense of it's teachers' responsibility. and even parents' responsibility. Parents are kind of expected these days to help kids with homework, something that really never happened in decades ago. Parents are more or less expected to make sure that their kids do the homework. It becomes part of the continuous involvement of adults assuming responsibilities for children and children not assuming the responsibilities themselves. Some people make a big deal out of the fact that we kind of went through this phase of, in adult-directed sports and activities, everybody gets a trophy, and some people have really decried that and thought that was behind the whole problem. I don't think that's the fundamental problem. I think the fundamental problem is that we took activities away from children and made them adult-directed. Whether we give them trophies just to the winners or to everybody once we've got this adult-directed sport, the fact of the matter is kids are not creating their own sport. They're not creating their own rules. They're not figuring out themselves what's fair and foul and how to create how to make the game work. And it's in that activity where kids are solving problems without adults present. That's where you learn how to take control of your life, solve your own problems. That's also where you develop the kind of emotional toughness that it takes to be an adult.
Evolutionary development psychologist. You study child development and play from a Darwinian perspective. I mean, that to me sounds like the survival of the fittest. Explain that to me. It's a fascinating mouthful.
All right. Well, we, like all life forms, are products of natural selection. The characteristics that we as human beings have came about because in the long run of our evolution, those characteristics promoted our survival and reproduction. So we are what we are because of this long evolutionary history. So I call myself an evolutionary developmental psychologist. Developmental psychologist means I'm interested in child development. What is the nature of children? How do children promote their own development? Why are children the way they are? When I ask those questions, I sort of frame it evolutionarily. Why are children so playful? Why are they so curious? Why are they so sociable, so attentive to other people around them? Why are they so willful? Why is it they want to do what they want to do rather than what we want them to do? And so I look at these characteristics that are, of course, these are characteristics of all human beings, but they are especially prominent in children. I look at these characteristics, and my answer to the question of why is because these are the precise characteristics that throughout human history have led children to educate themselves, led children to engage in the kinds of activities, make the kinds of observations that are going to lead them to successful adulthood. Children want to play with other children, biologically need to play with other children away from adults because that's where they practice the skills of being adult, the skills of negotiating differences with others, the skills of being able to see things from your peers' point of view. Because if you don't, your peers are not going to play with you. And that is real punishment. That's serious punishment to a child. So if I'm a kid and I'm bullying my friends and want them to do it my way, they'll just leave me and go and play with somebody else. And therefore I learn from that. I've got to pay attention to their needs. I can't just pay attention to my needs. So there's a whole host of things that children are biologically designed to practice and learn through play with other children. And when we deprive them of that, we deprive them of the opportunities to make use of their natural ways of learning how to be grown up and emotionally tough, and also at the same time how to be really attuned to the needs of other people and able to help satisfy those needs.
You know, Peter, it's not just theory or conjecture. An isolated child, a child that is isolated from play, or as you've said, play deprived, There's been the experimentation, there's been work in the lab, a play-deprived child. There are real consequences to this. This is not just theory.
Well, yes, that's absolutely right. Now, we can't, of course, do experiments with human beings in which we deliberately deprive one group of children of play and have this control group that is getting play and then compare the results. You can do that with laboratory animals, however. Years ago, there were experiments with monkeys along this line. It's now regarded as cruel to do this even with monkeys, to deliberately deprive young monkeys of the opportunity to play and then observe the results. But when those experiments were done, it's interesting to note that those young monkeys that had the opportunity to play with other young monkeys, and monkeys will only play if they're exposed to other young monkeys. They won't just play in isolation, and adults don't play with them. So these are with rhesus monkeys. Interestingly, these early experiments showed that when young monkeys are raised just with peers and not with their own mom, not with an adult, they actually do better in adulthood in a variety of ways than those that are raised with adults but no peers. In other words, for this social and emotional development to occur that enables them to be kind of socially and emotionally competent adults, peers are actually more important than adults. As I said, experiments along that line are no longer being done with monkeys, but there's a lot of such experiments with rats. There's a certain period developmentally when young rats, of course, grow up very rapidly in a matter of just about a couple of months. There's a period of a couple of weeks in which rats are extremely playful. And they need other young rats for this playfulness to come out. And there are experiments done that along this line. What if we isolate them just during those couple of highly playful weeks for the young rats? We isolate them from other young animals so they don't get that experience. Other rats we isolate maybe for a similar period of time, but not at that playful period. You do this experiment and you compare them in adulthood, and lo and behold, those rats that have been isolated and deprived of this opportunity to play at that critical stage in their development where they do play are socially and emotionally incompetent adults. You put them in a novel environment and they are frightened of that environment. They don't overcome the fear, unlike a normal rat who's initially frightened but then begins to explore it and gradually overcomes the fear. You put them with a novel peer, another young rat that they've never met before, and they alternate between acting terrified and acting in very ineffective ways, overly aggressive. They lash out. They don't know how to adapt themselves to novel situations in their environment. They're not able to regulate their fear and anger in the way that a rat can that grew up with play. What I'm arguing is that we human beings are not that different. We also need play to learn these skills. And as I said, we can't do these experiments with human beings. But in a certain sense, we've got a natural experiment going on here, sad to say. Over the past 50 years, there has been a continuous decline in the freedom of children to play and explore with other children away from adults. And over the last 50 years, there's been a continuous, gradual increase in the degree to which our young people are suffering from emotional and, I would argue, also social disorders. Over the last couple of decades, where there's been sort of a heightened, a more rapid decline in children's opportunities to play and explore than what was occurring before. We've seen what appears to be an acceleration of emotional and social disorders among young people.
Peter, address or throw some data at the subject, the increase in suicide rates across the age spectrum. And also, if you might, bring up some discussion about the influx, the increased use of assorted drugs to treat what psychiatrists might see as a problem. I'm curious your perspective on those areas.
Yes, well, the suicide rate among children under age 15 is now about 4 times what it was in the 1950s, to the best that we could tell given the available data. There was a continuous increase in that suicide rate among children up until about the mid-1990s or so. It seems to have leveled off somewhat, although the data suggests that it's increasing again now. I think it began to level off in part because we became more aware of it. We began to develop more suicide prevention programs. We began to use psychoactive drugs, antidepressant drugs, which may or may not be helpful, but maybe they have been helpful in decreasing actual suicide. That at the same time, among young people aged 15 to 24, there has been over that same period of time, not quite as dramatic an increase, but more than a doubling of the suicide rate among that group from 1950s until today. And similarly, that seems to have leveled off in recent years. On the other hand, suicide rate among people kind of somewhat older adults, if you go, say, age 25 to about 40, the suicide rate has remained about stable over that period of time. And for elderly people who are in my age group now, the suicide rate has gone dramatically down over that same period of time. This kind of is consistent with the view that over time we have become, in some ways, a better world for older people and a worse world for younger people.
Listen, I want to bring this back to play for a second. So in my mind, I'm thinking about assorted chain reactions. So if we're seeing a decrease in play, we can lay out all the benefits to play. But if we're seeing a decrease in play, I think to myself, okay, less kids are playing. Well, then what do kids do? And I look at the last 15 or 20 years. Well, clearly, because I've seen this with my nephews, even though they like to play sports, there's been a lot more video game increase. So I think to myself, okay, a lot more video game increase, a lot more sitting on one's rear end. And then I look around these days, and not only is it just my eyeballing the situation, but the data supports we've got a real weight problem with younger people. I mean, an obesity epidemic with young people. And I look back at some of this and I wonder, gosh, really, is a lot of this tied back to the lack of play, parents directing things? And if kids were just sent outside and said, don't come home, you got to go run all day long, and that's it.
Well, there's a number of things that you raise here. First, let me just say something about video games, because there's a lot of concern about video games. A lot of people don't go quite as deeply as you just did, even in that very brief discussion that you presented. And they say, okay, I see more and more video games, I see more and more obesity, and I hear about this decreased emotional resilience in young adults. Maybe video games are the cause of the whole thing. I hear people arguing that. Maybe if we just ban video games, that will solve the problem. I find myself always arguing against that position. And let me tell you why. First of all, let me say some things in defense of video games. Number one, this is real play. Video games really are play. And especially the ones that are coming out today. They're very creative. They promote a great deal of intellectual effort. To do well in them, you really have to work at them. You really have to concentrate. There's actually a lot of evidence, and I've written a blog post on this entitled The Many Benefits of Video Games. You can find it on my Psychology Today blog. There's actually a lot of research showing really powerful cognitive benefits of playing video games. People are in many ways becoming smarter because they're playing video games. Now, video games are sedentary, and so one might expect that video game players, heavy video game players, and people who play video games a lot are more likely to be obese than people who don't. Surprisingly, even to me, I have to confess, the data suggests otherwise. There are actually been some studies, which I refer to in that blog post, looking at whether there's a correlation between obesity and amount of video game play, and there is not. We are becoming obese, but apparently it's not so much related to video game play as other things. Video game players are, interestingly, less likely to watch television than non-video game players, but not particularly less likely to play outdoors than non-video game players. A lot of these things that we attribute to video game play don't seem, when you actually get into the statistics, don't seem to be attributable to them. Video game play is not socially isolating these days because you're playing it often online with other kids. Now, admittedly, you're not facing with them face to face, unless, as often happens in the context where I observe children playing, they're actually playing in the same room, so they are also physically together playing these video games. For boys in particular, video games are also a route for socialization. They talk about the video games with others. They compare strategies. This becomes a vehicle for making friends and getting to know other people. And if you're not doing video games, you're sort of out of that particular loop. All that in defense of video games. I think that video games are perfectly fine. I do, however, think that video games have, in some cases, in many cases perhaps, become a replacement for outdoor play, not so much because the video games are so seductive that the child has no interest in playing outdoors, but because the child has reduced opportunities to play outdoors. If you can't go outside and find other kids to play with and get involved in real adventures with other kids away from adults, then if you do go outside, even if your mom says, go outside, I want you outdoors, stay outdoors. You go outside, but there's nobody else to play with. There's nothing interesting to do. Playgrounds have been made to be so tame and so uninteresting that nobody beyond a certain age has any interest in playing on those playgrounds anymore. There aren't other kids out there. Kids are not attracted to the great outdoors. They're attracted to other kids. And so the kid is going to say, well, if I want to communicate with my friend, I'd got to get on and if I can't go indoors, I'll just get on my iPhone here and communicate with them. And then we say, oh, how terrible. They're just on their electronics all the time. But we don't stop to think about, where does the real fault lie here? Is it the kid's fault for wanting to be on the electronics, or is it our fault for creating a world where that's kind of the only interesting place for the kid to be?
Let me bring this back to a positive perspective. I wouldn't call what we discussed so far negative, but I think people might want to imagine some uplifting aspect to this. So if all these things we're talking about have some merit, I think you also have some ideas for perhaps different directions or ways that this lack of play, some of these assorted issues that we've talked about today, ways that we might be able to go to help people get back to a certain place that perhaps is better than where many kids are today.
Well, I think that the real challenge for our society now is how to create safe places and opportunities, and interesting and exciting places and opportunities for children to play away from adults. And I always add that, away from adults, because as long as adults are present and as long as adults are feeling like it's their responsibility to solve the problems in play, then children are not going to be truly playing, because they're going to be under sort of the direction of adults, and adults are going to be solving those problems. They're not going to learn all the things that I say they need to learn. I think that there's nothing about today's world that should prevent us from being able to create those opportunities. I think that it takes, however, some initiative. We have to recognize that this is something that's important for our society and for the future of people in our society. Once we make it a priority, there's lots of ways to solve this problem. So, for example, just one example, in Europe, they have what are called adventure playgrounds. These are playgrounds with all kinds of fascinating things you can do. Some of them say they kind of look like junkyards, but what better kind of place to play? I mean, kids have always been attracted to junkyards. They love to. There's all kinds of things you can build with them, all kinds of things you can do with them. They have tools in these places. They have things you can climb on. And the general rule at these is that parents are really maybe invited to look at it at first, but they're not particularly invited to stay. They're not really welcome to stay. But instead, they have a play worker there, somebody who's called a play worker, who has been well trained or who's learned how to be present without intervening, how to be there kind of as a lifeguard, kind of as a helper when called upon, but not as somebody who's going to get involved and solve minor disputes. Certainly not somebody who's going to act like a coach telling people what to do or how to do it, but somebody who's just there that helps assure the adults that, okay, this is safe because there's an adult here. This is something, there are a couple of such places in the United States, not going quite as full in the direction of excluding parents as is true in Europe. But I think this is the right direction, and this is one kind of thing we can do. Here's another thing. Whenever I talk to people involved with schools here in the United States, I suggest this. And yet, as far as I know, nobody has taken up this suggestion. What if we made schools, play areas, after school? You know, there's this period between 3 o'clock when school ends and about 5 or 6 o'clock when parents are home from work. And parents, I would think, would love it to have a place for their kids to play, a safe place for their kids to play. Schools have outdoor playgrounds. They've got gymnasiums. Some of them have swimming pools. They've got art supplies. They've got computers. They've got all these great things to play with. You could have age mixed play after school. It wouldn't take, you could have 1 or 2 adults or maybe an adult and a couple of teenagers who are there just, you know, like those play workers, just to make sure that things are safe, to make sure that things don't get terribly out of order and so on. This would be a very inexpensive way to enable play, and I think that parents would welcome it. And schools could also play a role in educating parents about the importance of free play. What is it that children learn in free play that they're not learning when adults are directing them, that they're not learning in their formal classes in school? It would be great if teachers saw themselves as educators more broadly about what children need for education, and schools providing more broadly what children need for education. Children are getting too much classwork, too much homework, too much adult direction. They're not getting enough opportunity to be creative and to explore, to play on their own. So those are just a couple of ways. There are many other ways. I might mention there's a book by a fellow named Mike Lanza, who lives in California. The book is called Playborhood. It's like neighborhood, but play in front of it, Playborhood, where he talks about how he turned his neighborhood into a playborhood. This was a middle-class suburban area where there were apparently quite a few kids, but you never saw them outdoors. And he created such a, he basically, what he did is he put their family's playground equipment in the front yard rather than the backyard. And he made it so attractive. And his whole family would have their picnics out in the front yard. They spent a lot of time out in the front yard. And pretty soon, all the people in the neighborhood got to know them, and the kids got to know them. And they welcomed the kids to come and play there. Their front yard became the neighborhood playground. And suddenly there were kids outdoors playing, and suddenly the kids got to know one another. And my understanding is now that they're getting older, they're adventuring off to other areas. In his book, he describes for 7 different kinds of communities how adults got together and solved the problem in their community, in their particular setting, of enabling free, non-supervised, non-directed child play. This problem can be solved, but it takes a will to solve it. It takes some adult initiative to create the conditions that will allow parents to feel that it's safe for their kids to go out and play, and will allow the kids to see that it's fun to go out and play.
You know, the thing that's interesting here, too, if I look at your perspective, this Darwinian perspective, even though things might be going in a direction that I might think is unusual, that you maybe think could be put into a different direction, we are still going in an evolutionary perspective. It might be an odd evolution, but we continue to evolve, even if it might be going down a path that highly educated people think, you know, there's some real problems here. It's still an evolution, isn't it?
It is. This is a cultural evolution, a social evolution. And in this case, we kind of have to take the reins, not just let it happen naturally. We have to push it along to make this happen. But, there's another sense. Let me give you another sense in which, in a certain sense, this is an evolution to bring us back to where we were. Bring us back to where we were throughout most of human history, because human biology isn't changing. Human biology changes very, very, very slowly and gradually, whereas culture changes very rapidly. Part of my research has been to look at how children grow up in hunter-gatherer cultures, the kinds of cultures that human beings lived in 99% of the history of our species. We were all hunter-gatherers. Well, there are certain groups of people who've survived as hunter-gatherers into relatively modern times, certainly into the last half of the 20th century. And there were a lot of researchers who were out there making contact with them, learning about their ways of living and so on. I did a study a few years ago where I surveyed some of those anthropologists who had studied hunter-gatherer cultures in various different parts of the world. And what I learned from every single one of those anthropologists, about every single one of those hunter-gatherer groups that had been found, is that children from age 4 on into their mid to late teenage years are playing and exploring all day long away from adults. Very little work is expected of them. There's nothing like schools there. Children are playing and exploring, and they are in their play and exploring, practicing the skills of the society. They're learning the toughness. The adults in those cultures, if you ask them, well, why don't you make the children do more work, or why don't you teach the children? They'll say the children teach themselves. They learn through play and exploration, and that's why they need to play and explore. So they have a certain philosophy of education that is, in a sense, the opposite of our philosophy of education.
Peter, you lay out some extremely interesting ideas, and I think you've probably given my audience some great food for thought today. Your book is free to learn. You're easily found online. As you mentioned your blog several times, people can check that out. Any other place we should send them?
Yeah, no, I think that looking at the blog, looking at my book, Free to Learn, the subtitle of the book is Why Unleashing the Instinct to Play Will Make Our Children Happier, More Self-Reliant, and Better Students for Life. I think that shows how the book ties to this finding that today we have so many young adults who don't seem to have developed that self-reliance. The one other place people might look if they're interested in these alternative approaches to education, I'm also involved with a website that's called alternativestoschool.com. You can easily find that lays out various ways that in our world today it's possible to there are alternatives to conventional schooling where children can take charge of their own education and they can be in environments where they have plenty of opportunity to learn and explore with other children.
Peter, I appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.